This is a true crime podcast. It contains adult themes and content and may not be suitable for all listeners. Listener discretion is advised.
When a guard would stop and talk to you, you used to stand back and you would yell so people could hear what you were saying to that guard as they walked by or within the vicinity.
But he knew what a convict was going to do before they thought of it themselves. He'd just been around that long, and he was tough.
They'd find Sprocky in about every conceivable place you could imagine, which we would, of course, dump.
They'd wait until everybody was locked up, and he would open his door and run down to cell one and get a bugler can full of Sprocky and take it back to his cells.
She had a kind of a hypnotic power. There were a great many wild cats around the penitentiary, and most people couldn't get near them. But she would stand in the doorway of the cell house and say, "Kitty, kitty, kitty," and those cats would go to her.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Stool, Pigeon Saturday. Today I've got a very special guest, the one, the only, one of our best tour guides here. This is Jack Hourcade. He's here to tell some great stories. So welcome, Jack.
Hi, Anthony. Thank you. I've been looking forward to this.
Yeah. So, Jack, can you just tell us a little about yourself, about, what brought you here? What were you before you were a volunteer here?
Sure. I came to Boise in '87 as a professor in the College of Education at Boise State and retired a few years ago, looking for something to do. Always found the old Idaho Penitentiary to be just fascinating. Frankly, architecturally was the main draw for it. I just love the way the place looks and feels. Oh, yeah. And so came out here a number of times and increasingly got drawn into the stories. So when I retired and was looking for something to do, the idea of volunteering out here occurred to me. Came out for an initial training, got caught up in it, and been doing it now for about a year and a half.
Yeah. If you look at any of our Google reviews, our TripAdvisor reviews, you'll see Jack's name all over it. He's always out here giving tours. So if you've come out in the last year, you've probably taken a Jack Hourcade tour.
Well, it's much the same as the university stuff, except frankly with more interesting content.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's inherently fascinating.
I think so.
Yeah, you've really spurred on a lot of our volunteers to want to really dig deep and learn these stories. And yeah, so I really appreciate you coming on and doing the same thing for me right now for the podcast. You dug into a difficult case. It's long and it's tedious and
it's frankly my own fault because you and Sky have done these stories of folks who have stumbled once, done time here, straightened themselves out, and gone on to lead great lives, defined as no further corrections experiences. And so I was more interested in the opposite side of the coin, not realizing that every time he came back, I would have to do another bit of research. And so that's who we have today. Yeah. William Ferdinand Dreyer, who was a prolific writer, but mostly what he was writing was bad checks. So, as best I can tell, I think he may hold the record for most visits here to the penitentiary. He was in for 5 different terms, not to mention a couple of terms outside this state, which we'll get into here in just a bit.
Yeah, wow. That's an impressive. What's the kind of time span for this?
Mr. Dreyer initially came into the penitentiary in the mid-1930s, and he did his last stretch in prison in the 1950s. Yeah. So most of his adult life, although I didn't calculate it accurately, much more of his life was spent behind bars than not.
Let's get to it. Let's hear about William Dreyer.
William Ferdinand Dreyer. He's born in Idaho Falls, here in Idaho, out in Bannock County, April 26, 1914. Some sources say 13, but I think 14 shows up more often. His dad, Charles Frederick Dreyer, was an immigrant from Denmark. His mom, Carolyn Rosella Dreyer, is from Utah. He had a couple of older sisters, an older brother, one younger brother, Harold, that we'll talk about, and also a younger sister. So he finished 9th grade, pretty typical education level for his time in the late 20s. As a 16-year-old, he worked as a deliveryman for a dairy there in eastern Idaho. He got married. He married Edna Harris in the LDS 3rd Ward in Idaho Falls, February 1933. So Idaho Falls, one of the bigger cities here in Idaho, about 60,000 people today. It was basically nothing until the late 1800s, and then the train station came through, and irrigation began. And once those things began, Idaho Falls became kind of the cultural, economic center, eastern Idaho, northern Utah. So, Mr. Dreyer, he's a young man now. He's married, 19 or 20 years old. His first writing efforts with bad checks were in November of 34. He forged several checks in Idaho Falls. And we need to talk a little bit about these bad checks. One way you can have a bad check is through you writing checks on your own account where you have insufficient funds. That was not Mr. Dreyer's style. Instead, he was a check forger. Now, back in the day, 100 years ago, checks did not have personal information in the top left and did not have all the bank routing and account numbers on the bottom. They simply had the name of the bank, and you would fill in the normal components of the check.
We have a great oral history from former inmate Melvin Aldis from August 24th, 1985, about the allure of forgery.
We call them paper hangers, which is check writers. And they figure these things out before they ever start. And they get their checks all made up, and they'll put $500 in a bank. And boy, they'll just go around and write about $15,000, $20,000 on this $500 and put it in another bank under another name, because they know they're going to get caught. And they'll do this in about 3 banks, and sure enough, they get caught. Well, they've got about $60,000 put away by this time, and they do their 11 months, and they figure that's real good wages. And they'll live on that for quite a while. And then they'll turn around and they'll start and do it all over again. So it has its drawbacks, and it has its planning. Like I say, there's some people in there that are really geniuses.
So, Mr. Dreyer apparently would get counter checks. These were blank checks with no personal information or account information of any sort, and then he would write fake names on them and for various amounts. The first time he did this was in November 1934. He pled guilty to the charges there in Idaho Falls. He was sentenced to be imprisoned here at the penitentiary from 1 to 14 years. But, likely because this was a first offense, that sentence was immediately suspended, and he was paroled. And here we go. He's arrested again for check forgery a few weeks later, February 35, pled guilty in March of 35. He's again given a 1 to 14-year sentence, the same as his previous suspended sentence. They're to be done consecutively here. So he shows up here on the grounds of the old Idaho Penitentiary, March 31, 1935. His initial intake form shows him to be 6'1", unusually tall for the time, 150 pounds, so a slender man, blue eyes, brown hair, light complexion, listed as married, and his occupation is dairyman.
Except for dairyman, it sounds like you're describing me.
Well, not nearly as handsome, of course. A face made for radio, as they say. Yeah. So, a month later, the sheriff of Bannock County here in Idaho is Pocatello. The sheriff contacts the warden and says, by the way, hold this fellow. We want to talk to him. Put a hold on him. Notify me a few days before his time is up so I can come after him. And this is a pattern of holds and detainers on Mr. Dreyer exists for the next 30 years. The warden here at the penitentiary, as he routinely did for new prisoners coming in, contacts the judge and the prosecuting attorney to ask their opinion of this fellow. What's his situation? Any words of advice you might have for me as the warden here? The prosecuting attorney, Henry Martin of Bonneville County, Idaho Falls, is response to the warden's request for information about Mr. Dreyer and says, this boy has forged a number of checks. He seems rather hard to do anything with. He concludes that Mr. Dreyer is, quote, an habitual criminal and a menace to society. This is as a 20-year-old. And Mr. Martin, the prosecuting attorney, follows up with another letter, August 35, saying he began forging checks as soon as he was paroled initially, and that, quote, William Dreyer is a man whom more than the minimum sentence would do some good. So, the next month, September 35, Mr. Dreyer requests that the Idaho governor release him from one of these 2 consecutive sentences. Mr. Dreyer says, bless his heart, I have now realized my serious mistakes in my young life, and I am trying very hard to make good. There was no response to this. He made a similar request again in November, and then he got his a pardon on his first sentence. So he's doing his second sentence now. April of 36, he applies to the governor for executive clemency. He says, I have employment promised, and I have my family depending upon my support. His father follows that up with a handwritten letter to the Board of Pardons on June 26 of 1936. Dad is asking for a pardon for his son. I have Dad's letter here, and the handwriting is shaky. This is an elderly man who's not well. It's just a heartbreaking kind of note. In part, Dad says, his mother's health is very poor. The doctor has x-rayed her, and she must be operated on. If our boy was home, he could help me earn some money to have her taken care of. I can only make enough myself for a meager existence. William was never a bad boy at heart. He is anxious to care for his family. And then Dad follows this up with a second letter a month later saying, we sure need his help at home. The family's having a hard time to make a living, and there are several jobs here that he can get. Yeah. So, on November 12, 36, William Dreyer officially applies for a pardon at the expiration of his minimum sentence. That pardon was granted January of 37, effective April 1st, 37. It includes the typical kind of pardon requirements, including that he report in to the sheriff of Bonneville County. The sheriff was contacted by the Idaho Secretary of State saying this fellow was going to be released. Mm-hmm. The sheriff was told by the Idaho State Penitentiary, I hope you'll keep a careful check on him. The parole board was fully convinced that this prisoner should not be granted an unconditional pardon. So, he's released in April 37.
Do you know, did he ever explain why he was writing these checks? Is it for his wife and his family that's growing, or was it?
It's never really explained. There are increasing references as he goes along this rocky path that alcohol played a significant role in his mistakes. So he's released in April of 37. June of 37, he's forging checks again in Bonneville County, arrested, pled guilty. He's sentenced again to the standard 1 to 14 years at the pen, comes in June of 37. At that time, his occupation is listed as a barber, and you would think a barber can make a living. Yeah. He's listed as divorced here, and we have no idea whatever happened to Edna Harris. His Bertillon files show that he's got, and this is confusing to me, multiple small scars on his hands, arms, feet, thigh, and neck, and they're identified as cut scars. I haven't seen, I don't know if that means he was maybe injured in fights or something, because he doesn't really have that kind of history, but he has these so-called cut scars. So, the warden for the second time contacts the prosecuting attorney and the judge. Prosecuting attorney from Bonneville County, Mr. Henry Martin, says, we've had a lot of trouble with this person. He does not seem to be able to get away from his stealing habits. Now, one of the things that I kind of like about these old documents from the 30s is the utter bluntness with which these folks spoke. The judge, C.J. Taylor, was asked, what's your analysis of Mr. Dreyer? The judge says he is, quote, a no-account criminal type. So, in a June 36 letter, Mr. Dreyer's father, Charles Dreyer, had said that his mother was not well. She needed an operation. That was unfortunately prophetic. Yeah. October 37, the governor gives permission for Mr. Dreyer to go back to Idaho Falls for his mother's funeral. 38, his work progress report shows that he's been working as a barber here. He was judged to be a good worker. He's assigned to the Eagle Island prison farm late in 38. In February of 38, he applies for pardon yet again. He says, I have been slow to realize the seriousness of writing a small check and signing someone's name other than my own. Now, his reference to a small check suggests that he's not really terribly self-aware of his behaviors.
Yeah.
He says, but I'd like to go to barber school, and if you could release me, that's what I'll do. He's granted a conditional pardon November 38. He's out free at last, and of course...
oh, my gosh.
Well, we're into the movie Groundhog Day at this point. He's released November 1938. 4 weeks later, December 1938, He's forging checks in Bonneville County.
No.
He pleads guilty, sentenced on September 23rd, 38, to 3 to 14 years. So the minimum now has bumped from 1 to 3. And his first alias appears, Mr. Ross Johnson.
Ross Johnson. Oh, William.
Yeah. So the warden contacts the prosecuting attorney again. The judge again, tell me what you think. At this point, Henry Martin, who was the prosecuting attorney, is now the judge in Bonneville County.
Nice.
And he's unfortunately very familiar with Mr. Dreyer. So the warden says, Mr. Martin, what do you think? Mr. Martin says that Mr. Dreyer's associates are, quote, mostly idlers, and that forgery seems to become a habit arising out of idleness and profligacy. He says that Mr. Dreyer is, quote, a menace to society. Now, it's funny. I think menace to society, I think Jimmy Cagney and submachine guns and such. But no, Mr. Dreyer is at that level with nothing more than a pen. So he comes back to the penitentiary. August 39, Mr. Dreyer is given permission to attend his father's funeral.
Oh, man.
1940, largely uneventful. Mr. Dreyer is assigned to the Eagle Island State Prison Farm. I'm assuming you and Sky have talked about that farm in the past. It's off the grounds here, and large agricultural operation, largely for folks who are trusted. December 9, 1940, Mr. Dreyer and a companion escape from the Eagle Island farm. I'm sorry. 3 weeks later, he's arrested again. This time he's in Dillon, Montana, as the newly emerged Ross Johnson. He's writing checks in Dillon, Montana as Ross Johnson. He pleads guilty as Ross Johnson on January 14th, 41. He's given a 2-year suspended sentence. He's to report in monthly to his parole officer. He did not do so.
I was going to say, how long? When did that first report come in? Ever?
It was only at that time that the Dillon, Montana sheriff learned that Ross Johnson was indeed our friend, Mr. Dreyer. A couple of weeks later, he's arrested again, Mr. Dreyer is, in Salt Lake City on charges of forgery, check forgery, and escape. He'd also, during this 2-week period, written several fraudulent checks in Bingham County. Bingham County is Blackfoot, Idaho. And also in Pocatello as Frank Saunders. So he comes back here to the penitentiary here in Boise on February 2nd, pled guilty in April to the escape charges, sentenced for 1 to 5 additional years to be tacked on to his present sentence for forgery.
Yeah.
As soon as he's here, he becomes very popular. Dillon, Montana, Pocatello, Idaho, Idaho Falls, they all contact the warden saying, don't let him go without letting us know. We want holds on him because he's got to face forgery charges at our places. He receives a pardon for his initial forgery charge in July 41, and so now he moves to serving his time on his escape charge. And here is where we get to kind of an interesting national phenomenon that plays out here. 1942, the U.S. is in World War II, deeply engaged, and success is far from certain at this point. The Allied forces are struggling badly. One of the tremendous needs is for soldiers. So, many states start investigating the possibility of penitentiaries sending men to, instead of serving their sentences out, go into the armed services and serving their country that way. Mr. Dreyer had been in the National Guard here in Idaho as a young man. From 1930 to 1934, he was dishonorably discharged. His brother, his younger brother we mentioned, is also in the Army. So, Mr. Dreyer, in February 42, applies for a pardon so he might enlist in the U.S. Army. The chief parole officer of the penitentiary here, Mr. Walter Rhodes, contacts the sheriff back in Dillon, Montana, who had a hold on Mr. Dreyer. And the parole officer here from the penitentiary says, we're figuring on getting him back into Army service. It won't be too easy for him to be reinstated, perhaps, but he has papers from his old bunch, presumably the National Guard, asking him to come back. And the parole officer sent similar notes to Bannock County and Bingham counties. None of them objected to the plan. So this is all looking pretty good. April 42, he's pardoned on the Bonneville County forgery charges, but instead of entering the Army, for reasons I couldn't figure out, he moved to Salt Lake City. So, he's now in Salt Lake City.
Yeah.
It's April 9, 1942. 3 weeks later, May 1st, 1942, Mr. Dreyer is again forging checks in Bonneville County. He was rearrested. Similar charges were filed by Bannock County in May, by Bingham County in September, and again in December. He pleads guilty in December 42, sentenced to 3 to 14 years at the penitentiary.
Wow.
The warden contacts his old pen pals, the district judge and the prosecuting attorney. Judge Martin, the former prosecuting attorney, says, in terms of his associates, that they're like himself, of little worth.
Of little worth.
The judge goes on to say, bless his heart, Mr. Dreyer might be able to contribute to the war effort through some sort of contractor engaged in technical work. So they're looking for warm bodies to help in the war effort.
Oh, my God.
The prosecuting attorney is less optimistic.
We've tried
He says
this.
He's been given several chances to no avail.
Wow.
So, the warden is, here at the old Idaho Pen, is absolutely fixed on the idea of Mr. Dreyer serving in the war effort in some way. So, February 44, the warden writes the sheriff of Dillon, Montana, to see if his charges there were cleared as, quote, he wants to be inducted into the Army. The sheriff says, well, he had a suspended sentence of 2 years, and that sentence is over. He's violated parole, but we really don't care.
Right.
So they sent similar letters to Bingham counties and Blackfoot counties here in Idaho saying, hey, we're thinking maybe he could go in the Army. What do you guys think? Both of them said, hey, it sounds great. It'd be good for him, good for the country.
Good.
So everything's looking good, but May 44, things have changed a bit. The Army has decided that they will no longer take men straight from the prison or penitentiary. Instead, such men would have to be out on parole for 6 months and be successful, and then the Army would take them in.
Yeah.
So the warden, and I can't believe his single-minded dedication to this notion, contacts Dillon, Montana, and Bingham County and Bannock County again, saying, okay, things have changed. Would you guys be okay if he goes out for 6 months on pardon and then goes into the Army? And Bingham County says, okay. Bannock County says no. In fact, they repeated no twice. July of 44 and again August 44, they say no. We want to prosecute him.
Yeah.
But they changed their minds by September. In 44, saying, we're going to cancel our hold, but, by the way, Ogden, Utah would like to speak to you about Mr. Dreyer.
There we go.
So, the warden writes Ogden, Utah, saying, in September 44, hey, we're thinking about maybe this new thing where he gets out on pardon for 6 months and then goes in the Army. Are you guys good with that? They say, it's been so long that all the witnesses have disappeared, so we're going to withdraw our detainer. So, he's going to be released June 6, 1945.
Nice.
So, Mr. Dreyer is released on parole effective June 6, 45. 2 weeks after his release from the Idaho State Penitentiary, Mr. Dreyer is arrested in Butte, Montana on a charge of, quote, obtaining money by a false and worthless check. He's sentenced to a 3-year term in the Montana State Prison, Deer Lodge, Montana. In July 45, Warden Clapp from here at the Idaho State Penitentiary contacts his counterpart there in Montana, asking for a retainer on Mr. Dreyer for his parole violation after his sentence in Montana is concluded. November 15, 46, Mr. Dreyer writes Warden Clapp here at the Idaho Penitentiary, asks that the Idaho retainer be released. Mr. Dreyer says, I'm going to be released in 6 months. I'd like to stay here in Montana. I'm going to set up a barber shop here. He says, living in Montana, it's going to keep me away from my old farmer associates. And Mr. Dreyer also wrote something that just grabbed me. He says, quote, after all, a man has to get some sense sometime in his life. I figure this is the time for me.
How old is he now? He's like,
this is 46.
30s.
Yeah, he's born in 14. So, yeah, he's
32-ish.
Yeah, early 30s.
Oh, man.
So, Mr. Dreyer has written the warden asking that the Idaho retainer be released. The warden writes back November of 46, saying the Idaho Board of Pardons was voted out of existence. We're not going to have a new board before July 47. Thus, there's no board now to do anything about your case. Our advice to you is just to wait. Mr. Dreyer instead writes the governor asking his detainer be lifted. And by the way, maybe you could, pardon me. No response. April 47, Warden Henry of the Montana State Prison writes Warden Clapp here in Idaho saying, "We're going to discharge Mr. Dreyer May 14, 1947. The Idaho Director of Paroles, Mr. Fales, writes back saying, "Are you going to parole or pardon him? If you're going to parole him, we'll just have our parole run concurrently with yours. If you're going to pardon him, we're willing to reinstate parole for him with conditions." The Montana State Prison warden writes back, "We're not going to parole or pardon him. He's just finished his time here. We're done." The Idaho Director of Parole says, "We will not give him further opportunities to make good if he fails us this time." And you can imagine the finger waggling. So the Montana State Prison warden says, "By the way, Mr. Dreyer is, quote, thoroughly aware of Idaho's parole requirements." He's released May 14, 1947. August 19, 1947, Idaho State Board of Correction learns that Mr. Dreyer has violated his parole, concludes he should come back here to the Idaho State Penitentiary for parole violations. Mr. Dreyer admits in a written notarized statement that he indeed violated his parole for, quote, failing to report and being arrested by the police department of Pocatello, Idaho for passing no good checks.
Jeez.
So he comes back here in August of 1947. He's first assigned to the inmate barbershop, and then apparently things go very well. He's assigned to the guards barbershop.
Yeah.
Bannock County contacts the warden. "Hold him. We want him when you're done with him." So Idaho, in early 48, Idaho Department of Probation and Parole contacts Pocatello to see, you still plan to prosecute Mr. Dreyer? If so, we're going to release him to you so you can prosecute him. If you don't want to prosecute him, we're going to keep him here longer.
Jeez.
Pocatello says, "Oh no, hold him. We are still very desirous of prosecuting the man Dreyer, unless he's to be held at the penitentiary for 1 year or more." The police chief of Pocatello, and again, I love the blunt way in which these guys talk. They're just so critical of Mr. Dreyer when they're telling the warden to hold him. The police chief of Pocatello, Mr. Rubidoux, says, "Before he gets out of the city of Boise, he'll place out some more checks for extra money to have a good time on." So, March 48, Idaho State Board of Corrections announces that Mr. Dreyer is going to receive a conditional release. He's released to Pocatello with his brother Harold supposedly in charge of him. Mr. Dreyer again violates his parole conditions. He begins traveling with an ex-convict associate of his. He visits Washington State. He visits Utah. He gets back to Pocatello, where he's promptly arrested for leaving the state twice without permission of his parole officer, associating with a known convict, using alcohol to excess, public intoxication, and forgery.
I was going to say, when he was traveling, was it under his own name? Or
It was a funded expedition.
Yeah.
So, Mr. Dreyer, and I'm not quite sure why, Mr. Dreyer admits to all the charges except for forgery. I would never forge.
What? Never.
So the Pocatello police chief, Mr. Rubidoux, contacts Warden Clapp and says, "I know he's been at your place a while. Can you send us some samples of his handwriting so we can compare it to the checks? We're pretty sure it's him."
Oh, jeez.
And Warden Clapp sends him back the fingerprint card, a copy of his parole agreement. Mr. Dreyer apparently is shown all this material and pleads guilty to all of the parole violation charges. The sentence is suspended.
What?
And Mr. Dreyer is released back to his brother under parole with the usual conditions. Refrain from lawbreaking, gainful employment, pay off your bad checks.
And he stayed out of prison for the rest of his life, right?
If I were writing the story, yes. But on September...
Oh, my God.
No, I'm sorry. In January 49, so this would be 4 or 5 months later, he's found to have violated the terms of his parole. He comes back to the penitentiary to complete his sentence of 3 to 14 years.
Did they just keep his cell how he liked it?
They turned back the covers and put a mint on the pillow. Yeah. He finishes out his sentence. He's released again in the early 1950s, 1951. At this point, Mr. Dreyer's in Idaho Falls, Idaho. March 31st, 1951, he writes a forged check in the amount of $73 at the Savings Center store there in Idaho Falls. In his written statement later, he says, "I was drunk at the time. I cannot remember too much about writing that check." So he's arrested April 11, 51, pled guilty May 4, 51. He's in front of his old friend, Judge Henry Martin, so they've got like a 20-year history now.
Yeah, they've grown up together.
They've grown up together. He pled guilty to the charge of issuing a fictitious check. He's given a sentence now of 5 years at the Idaho Penitentiary on May 7, 1951. Now, the state had appointed an attorney for Mr. Dreyer, Isaac McDougall. And Mr. McDougall is asked, investigate this case and get back to us. Give us your opinion. So Mr. McDougall wrote to the State Board of Corrections and says, from my investigation, it appears that Dreyer's story of being quite drunk at the time is substantially correct. Your advice would be appreciated.
Jeez.
So Mr. McDougall also explored with Warden Clapp the possibility, perhaps, of Mr. Dreyer serving time at the state hospital in Blackfoot for individuals with emotional and mental issues. And Mr. Clapp responds back, you can almost hear the indignation. There is nothing here in the history of Dreyer's long criminal career which would indicate that there should be any justification in committing him to State Hospital South as a mentally ill person.
Oh, my.
And you almost want to add, good day, sir.
Good day, sir. A lot of that, yeah.
So, apparently, while Mr. Dreyer was momentarily out, he went to Cache County, Utah, and wrote fictitious checks there. They contact the warden in October 1951 saying, please hold him. We would like to prosecute him after you release him.
Gotta glue his hands together. Don't give this man a pen.
Wow. So the warden contacts for the 5th time the prosecuting attorney and the judge to ask, what are your thoughts on Mr. Dreyer as he's back here for the 5th time? The prosecuting attorney says, this man appears to be an habitual bad check writer. It would seem that detention is the only means of protecting the public. So his intake form at this time lists his job as tinsmith. He answers yes to questions about whether he consumes liquor, whether he's a smoker, whether he's a gambler. For the first time, he lists his religion as Mormon, although his marriage was in an LDS ward there in Idaho Falls. His new charts show that he's acquired several tattoos along the way, and some of these are just wonderful to visualize. There's a hula girl.
Oh.
There's a dagger. Mother and father. And my favorite, quote, a girl in trunks.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, I'm assuming she has a top as well.
Yeah.
So, Mr. Dreyer is back here at the penitentiary, and surprisingly, his overall record here is pretty good, except for his escape from the prison farm. He's not been in any trouble at the penitentiary. He's often listed as a good worker. He was moved from the inmate barbershop to the guard barbershop. Overall, he's done pretty well here. The chaplain here was less convinced of Mr. Dreyer's reformation. In 1952, the chaplain notes, this man blames liquor for being the chief cause of his troubles. He is a doubtful subject for release. But he's got no punishment record whatsoever. March 1953, his records show completely clean, no issues whatsoever. He's been making regular payments to Cache County, Utah for the fictitious checks he wrote to the Skag Safeway store. He paid off all of it, which was less than $100. Yeah. They released their hold on him. He's released here from the penitentiary July 10, 1953. After 5 terms here, and of course the 1 term in Montana. So, August 21, 1953, Mr. Dreyer has not left the city limits. He and another man allegedly broke into a Boise storeroom leased by the Continental Life and Accident Company in downtown Boise. Mr. Dreyer is accused of stealing. Would you like to guess what he stole?
Checks?
Blank checks.
Oh, my
And then
God.
forging and cashing them in Weiser, Idaho. There's not much really to say. He's arraigned on these charges in December 1953. He pleads innocent. Now, there's no record of what happened after this, so he disappears from Boise. But by mid-1954, the next year, Mr. Dreyer shows up. He's being held at the Bannock County, Pocatello, Idaho County Jail on a new set of, quote, bad check charges, mid-1954. 1 a.m. on Sunday morning, July 4th, Independence Day, Mr. Dreyer and a cellmate saw their way out of the cell block, saw their way through a barred window, escaped down a rope. Wow. The accomplice is recaptured 3 weeks later. There's no record of Mr. Dreyer's capture.
Wow.
So he's out free and easy. Piecing it together afterwards, Mr. Dreyer apparently headed east for the Dakotas. From 1954 to 1960, he's arrested 9 times in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, Rapid City, South Dakota, Bismarck, North Dakota, for repeated instances of check forgery, obtaining money under false pretenses, and third-degree burglary. He's got a new alias now, Jack R. Morgan. So he enters the South Dakota State Penitentiary on May 13, 1960, with an 8-year sentence. He's released on February 13, 1966.
Wow.
So he's now in his mid-50s. After leaving the South Dakota State Penitentiary in 66, Mr. Dreyer moves to Minneapolis, Minnesota. At some point along the way, he had changed his middle name from Ferdinand to Frederick. He works in Minneapolis as a carpenter, and there is no further record of any sort of criminal activity. Wow. In fact, while he's there, he meets and marries a woman, Helen Ann Simpson, in October 68. They move to Salt Lake City. They have a son, Stanley Dreyer. Mr. Dreyer passes away in November 76 in Salt Lake City. He's buried in Taylorsville Memorial Park Cemetery. His wife passes away a few years later. She's buried after him. So the story has a happy ending. He said in an early request for parole that every man has to wise up at some point in his life, and he finally found the point at which it was appropriate for him to do that.
Wow, in his 50s.
In his mid-50s. Yeah, but he has a happy life thereafter.
Yeah.
There's a lovely picture of him in his obituary. He's grown into a distinguished-looking fellow. He had lots of family and friends who came to his service. Bless his heart, he turned it around.
Yeah. Well, some of us, it takes a little extra encouragement, a little bit chisel to get through that hard head. And
the main reason I wanted to look at a repeat offender is to try to understand better how this could be, because it makes no sense to any of us or anyone listening to this how you could just do the same thing and be punished so severely. And frankly, I didn't get terribly enlightened. The only thing I could come to was the fact that even when it's blatantly obvious to someone how bad your behavioral patterns are for your overall well-being, it is so difficult for some of these folks to change. And he is the most powerful living example of that I've ever come across.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that it wasn't until he changed that behavior that he was able to establish any kind of real life. I mean, he had no big friends outside of prison, certainly no family. He maintained communications with his one brother, and that was about it. It wasn't until he got out and kind of stayed out of trouble that he was able to establish what we would think of as a normal and fulfilling kind of social life.
Yeah, and if we reference Jerry Clapp, the son of Warden Lou Clapp, who actually knew William Dreyer and references him several times. So could you read us some of this for us?
The warden's son, Jerry, kind of grew up in prison in a very real way. And he knew William Dreyer, and he talked about him in his forthcoming book a little bit. He says that William Dreyer was an institutionalized man. He always told me that he was getting out for good and never coming back. However, he always came back. His parole would be approved, he'd be released, he'd be booked again. He just thrived, according to Jerry Clapp, in the structured environment of the penitentiary and couldn't survive before.
Just one of many great quotes from Jerry's memoir, which is slated to be released in the near future by Hidden Shelf Publishing.
Yeah.
He cut Jerry's hair. I use the barber here. He did. Not only other inmates.
In fact, Jerry went for a haircut as a teenager, and he walks into the barber shop, and he was expecting anybody but William Dreyer, but there's Bill Dreyer. Bill, it's nice to see you again. I got to have a haircut. Well, it's always good to see you too, Jerry. And he said Dreyer chuckled and draped the smock over him and started to cut his hair and told him a story about, I was down in Texas and I was robbing a house and I had all the household goods in a bag and I had them in a pillowcase over my shoulder and they caught me red-handed and I was in big trouble and they threw me in the tank. But fortunately, there was a guy there who was really drunk. And so I took his driver's license. And when they called his name the next morning, I walked out because he was still drunk and sleeping, and I got under his name, and I felt kind of bad for that guy, but I was out. I didn't want to be in Texas.
So how many more times could he have been imprisoned? How many times did he do stuff like that? Like, wow.
Well, and of course, these are only the times they got caught.
Right.
And maybe it's a 10-to-1 ratio of things you get away with versus the ones you get caught for.
Yeah.
So, but I actually take great solace in the obituary for Mr. Dreyer because there's a picture of him looking happy and distinguished and successful.
Yeah.
And I think, man, anybody can turn it around. Even this guy finally turned it around.
Yeah.
So there's hope for all of us.
Wow. Do you know, did he have any kids or anything after?
He did. He had a son, Stanley Dreyer. I tried to run down information on him and could not find anything. Okay. But, he had a full family and a full circle of friends at the end.
Well, Jack, great work. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for doing all of this research on William. That was quite the undertaking. We focus on one person every week,
Yeah.
Maybe a couple, but one person in this many times Sky and I haven't really discussed, so
it's amazing, and it's hard for folks today perhaps to understand what a big deal bad check writing was back in the day.
Yeah.
But without credit cards, nobody carried enough cash to pay for everything, and these poor stores kind of had to take your check, and it took days and days to clear.
Yeah.
So it was a ripe opportunity for someone like Mr. Dreyer to take advantage.
Right. Yeah. And now technology's changed, and a lot of us are safer in many other ways, but there are also, criminals are right there on the line. They've figured out different ways to do the same sort of thing with our modern technology.
Right. Clever guys can find ways to get money from less clever folks.
Exactly, yeah. Oh, man. Well, anything else you want to say or share?
I don't think so. I am... I know more about bad checks than I ever believed I would know in my lifetime.
That's good. Now I do, too. Yeah, I didn't know anything about these counter checks. That seems like... not the smartest idea, like a very trusting idea to me.
Well, that's why the checks, I think it was in the 70s when they began to put the automated routing number and stuff along the bottom, is to prevent folks like Mr. Dreyer.
Wow. Oh, all right, Jack. Thank you so much for being on this week. I appreciate it. You did such a great job.
Thank you, Anthony. This was great fun.
All right, let's do it again soon. Thank you all for listening. Do your own time, do your own number, and we'll see you next week.
If you enjoyed Behind Gray Walls, please rate, review, and subscribe so others can find our podcast. If you're interested in more Old Idaho Penitentiary information and to see the mugshots of the inmates featured in this episode, follow the Old Idaho Penitentiary on Instagram and Facebook. If you want to learn more about the Idaho State Historical Society and its other sites, follow ID State Historical Society on Instagram or visit history.idaho.gov. If you have a question or comment for the hosts, which we love to get, please email us at behindgraywalls@gmail.com.
I know an inmate was showing me one day, he told me he worked for me in the commissary. He said, Mr. Ross, I'll tell you how to get rich real quick. I said, how's that? He said, well, go out and work for a farmer for $1 an hour, and work for 8 hours, and quit, and hoping that he would pay you by check. So, he gives you a check for $8. Okay, and you get ready to cash that check. All you have to do is put a knot in front of behind the 8, and put a Y on the 8. 80 is still 8. You have a check for $80. And that's what they did.